Hey everyone, it's Hale here, and today I wanted to go over the project file for my flip of Mistakes Like Fractures by Knocked Loose. So the first thing I wanted to go over is the structure of the track. So we got something happening every 8 bars. We got an intro, which is just the kind of guitar riff with some atmosphere and effects going on. Then we have the intro with drums. Self-explanatory, got a sub in there as well as the main riff not being filtered as heavily in drums. Then we have the build-up. And then we have the drop. So that goes on for another 8 bars, and then we go into a post drop where it's the chorus from the original song. And then we go into the second build up. And then that goes into a 2-bar pre-drop. And then that goes into the second drop, which is 16 bars. And then we go into the outro, which is just the original song reverbed out. We've got some atmosphere. I did some stuff in the mixdown project file where I've added like a few extra bits and pieces, but this is what the outro just sounds like in this project. Once again, nothing crazy, just, atmosphere, reverb out, etc. All right, so the next thing that I wanted to go over is how I'm using a sidechain bus, and this is pretty common in like dubstep and bass music. So I'm using Shaperbox, and that's being triggered by this empty MIDI channel that just follows the same MIDI as the kick. That goes into Shaperbox, and if we open this up, you can see that we've got one envelope for the mids and highs. So this is for like all the synths above 228 hertz. And then the low band is a bit more significant, covering the sub and like the super low mids. Now let's go into the drums. So the drums are pretty simple. I'll just solo the drop. So nothing super crazy, and there's no processing on the drums group in this project file. I did a little bit in the mixdown project, but nothing super crazy then, just like limiting, saturation, EQ. For the kick, it's just a company kick. We've got a low pass filter for when in the second build the kick comes in, and then a glue compressor just to boost the volume without clipping it. We've got this reverse kick just to really add emphasis to certain beats that I wanted to emphasize. So this is what it sounds like in context. So that nice little vroom right into it really helps build tension. The clap is just this Virtual Riot rhythm clap, but Ableton's fuzz pedal really makes a lot of difference. So this is without the fuzz pedal. Pretty standard, and in context that sounds like this. So kind of weak, and I wanted the clap to have a lot more sustain that just kind of wasn't there. So the room reverb that you see here isn't super substantial right off the bat, but when you add the fuzz pedal to it, makes a hell of a difference. From there, we've just got some top loops, just something on every beat. We've got this ride, just on every odd beat, and then we got this top loop, which is only on the response parts of the drop. So for the call, which in this example is the riff, there's no top loop, but when the response comes in, we got the top loop, which is this one here. And that's a drum and bass top loop, but I've slowed it down to dubstep tempo, and that adds just like a nice little bit of groove for when the response bit hits. So yeah, that's kind of it for the drums. Now I wanted to go into the atmosphere. We have this in the intro, the builds, and the outro. So that's a couple of different layers. We've got this cave ambience here. And that's high passed a lot. Instead of just having it, just no processing and just having the ambience as it is, I wanted to have a sort of darker, lower sounding ambience on top of it. So this is the same sample but pitched down 17 semitones and with a pretty hard out low pass filter, and this is what that sounds like. And the two together would sound like this. Just nice and ominous. And then we have this abandoned factory sample. And then all together it sounds like this. Dope. And then in the drop, we have another little bit of ambience that isn't there when the intro and build ambience is taking place. And that's this little high-pitched saw here. So pretty basic serum patch, just basic shapes, super detuned, nothing even in the serum post-processing. And then we have this pedal on just to really bring out the harshness. And then some mid-side EQ. Cool, so let's talk about the drop now. Okay, so the first thing that I want to go over is that most of the drop is done in audio, and that lets me do like a few cool things. So I want to go over that I'm using the original, but I don't think the original song was done to a metronome because there's a bunch of different sections that are all wildly different tempos, and I couldn't quite get them warped correctly if I used just the same tempo throughout. So I did individual time stretching for each section that I wanted to use, and I'm using different channels for each part of the original that I want to use, just because sometimes I want there to be no low end, sometimes I want there to be some low end, and sometimes I want to cut different frequencies. I have different parts of the song that I want to use for different parts of my flip. I used this part of the original. That's been time stretched out. There's also a frequency shifter, which is more prominent in the second drop. And the fuzz pedal is like a little bit more prominent right at the end of the drop. But what's mainly being modulated is this EQ. There's a low pass and a high pass, and it just kind of sweeps out right before the next hit of the drop. So this is what that sounds like. So then from there, we go on to the sound design part. And once again, this is an audio, so this is what you're hearing in the drop. In context, there's a lot of post-processing afterwards, but before it got bounced into audio, sounds like this. And that's a couple of layers. We've got a respace, and we've got this operator patch I made. So this is the sound without any post-processing. So that's both layers with no post-processing. And this is what happens when we put the LFO tool on. Bit of volume modulation there. Then we got erosion here. Just adding a little bit of high-end fizz. It's on wide noise mode. Then we got this compressed room reverb. Mostly just compressing it. There's not a whole lot of reverb that you can hear. Then we get OTT. Amount is only at 20%, but I've bumped the output up and I've bumped the time up, so it's just sort of tightening up tonally, if you will. FabFilter Pro MB, without, with. So just taming some frequencies that I thought were kind of annoying, like the low mids were kind of getting a little muddy, so I used that to tighten this up a little bit. Then we put on a saturator. The saturator isn't actually doing anything, but earlier on in the sound design process, I think there was some clipping going on, so I put that on just to make sure nothing was going above 0. Then we got this kick tight corpus, and this is without and with. So that tightens it up tonally a little bit, brings out the high end quite nicely, makes the low mids a bit less present, saves using another OTT when I'm going to be using it later on in the processing chain anyways. We got some EQ, some mid-side EQ actually. So on the mid channel, I'm low cutting and doing some surgical cuts and also cutting the high end. And with the side channel, I'm doing something similar, but I'm boosting different parts. So boosting a little bit of the high mids, cutting a little higher up in the lower frequencies, and cutting around the same in the high frequencies. So without, with, just tames it a little bit. And then glue compressor at the end just to make sure nothing clips. And just compress everything too. And so this is what that sounds like after it's been resampled. So if I open this up and unfreeze it, here we go. So the main thing that's kind of doing all the pitch bends and stuff is the frequency shifter. That's without the frequency shifter and with. So making quite a big difference, and that gets used like throughout the drop. And there's already a pitch bend in the MIDI clips for the original bass, but that helps accentuate certain things that I wanted to bring out that weren't necessarily there. And then we've got this erosion, which is being used in the second part of this phrase. It's kind of bringing out some high frequencies, bit crushing them a little bit. Without it and with it. So it's super subtle, but just adds just like a little bit of sparkle when it does that like high pitch bend. Now you see all these OTTs and you might be thinking, what the hell is this? Why would you need this many OTTs? But the truth is, they're not actually doing a whole lot of OTTing, if you will. If I turn it off, this is what it sounds like. And if I turn it back on, I've actually got all of them, the amount at 0%. So all of these are sort of acting as a disperser. I started this project before I got the Kilohearts plugins, so these are basically acting as a disperser because each OTT is putting each frequency band just slightly out of phase. So when you duplicate it a lot, the effect becomes a lot more apparent. So without and with. And then I've got to reduce ambience. This is without. So this is with. This is without. Apologies for my CPU. Can't really help that. Then I've got wider. I don't think I used this, but... So that's just the Infected Mushroom wider plugin. I don't think I had that on in the final version, but I might have, but that's just adding a little bit more stereo width. We got this Valhalla Vintage, which is just a reverb throw. You can see the mix is being automated a little bit as the tail sort of comes through. Some more mid-side EQ, multi-band compression. This is without multi-band compression. And this is with. So brings out the high end kind of nicely, just compresses it, and just I've added a little bit more output, so it's just nice and in your face. And then a glue compressor to boot. All right, so that's the first bass, and then the second bass sounds like this. So the second bass is this one here. And there's also another layer to it, which is the first synth, but I've frequency shifted it. So it's super subtle, but it does make a little bit of a difference. I found when I first chucked in the womp, it sounded too staccato. So this is without. And this is with. So it's very subtle, but I think it does make like a little bit of a difference. Just makes it nice and consistent. And also, before we get into the sound design of the womp, I've actually resampled this little reverse reverb for the main bass. Just so every time it goes into it. And I've even put that in parts of the song when the first bass isn't even going to come in, just because I felt like it was a nice little reverse reverb. This is the Serum preset that I made here, without any processing, this is what that sounds like. And with, so pretty drastically different. The Serum patch itself isn't anything super crazy. We don't even have any FM going on. This is just a Serum wavetable that I found, the low pass filter. I'm modulating the cutoff and the resonance, so it becomes a little bit more resonant as the filter opens up. Pretty basic processing. I'm modulating the distortion with the same LFO as the filter resonance, but it's basically doing the same movement as the wavetable position. Same thing on the hyper, just so it's at its most detuned at the peak of the synth, and when it closes up, it becomes less detuned. And then another filter at the end, some EQ just to make sure I'm getting peaks that I didn't quite like. And let's go over the processing. The first thing that I've added to the chain is an erosion, so without the erosion, with the erosion. So right off the bat, that adds a nice little bit of high end. And I actually added that in pretty late into the sound design process. I was working on the sound and it sounded kind of dull compared to the main sustain bass. So I added that in. We've also got an LFO tool doing a similar envelope to what was in the Serum patch. And then that goes into a saturator. Without saturator, this is what it sounds like. With. So it makes it a little bit muddier, but it just adds like a nice little bit of drive and volume. Then we got OTT. With OTT, I actually end up a lot of the time taking the output of the low band all the way down. And then I crank the output up, and then another saturator. This is without the saturator. With. Just adding a little bit more volume and drive. Utility. And what the utility is doing is it's just making sure everything below 400 hertz is mono. Another Pro MB, sort of the MVP of this project, just really taming stuff that I found kind of problematic in the mixdown, even though we're not at the mixdown stage yet. Without. With. Taming the high end quite nicely, but also making sure that the mids and the low mids aren't acting up. And then we got this large chamber reverb throw. Nice. OTT again. Once again, we're cutting that low band. We're taking a little bit out of the mids. I'm not adding any more output to the high. And then we got the output cranked quite a bit at the end, but the amount only at 50%. So without the OTT, with the OTT, that was mostly just to bring out the reverb throw. And then we got this EQ, a little bit surgical, and just, bringing out the highs and cutting some mid stuff that I didn't like, cutting some high mid stuff that I didn't like as well. And then we got the Ableton multi-band compression preset, once again adding a lot of brightness, compressing it kind of nicely without. With. Just giving it a little bit more body than it originally had. And then a glue compressor again. And then I bounce that into audio, and this is what that sounds like. So not super different from how it originally was, but when you're in audio, you can do cool things like chopping things up, pitching them up, and this is what that sounds like. So I've created some interesting flows with that, especially in the second drop. Just things that you wouldn't be able to do if you're just like mapping an LFO to Serum. And I've added just another Pro MB because this instance of the bass is the basis of the main bass in the second drop as well. And I wanted to process that together. So let's get into that bass. So here it is right here. It sounds pretty different from the first drop womp, but this is the Serum patch. You can see it's got all the same processing as the first womp, and it's the same patch but with a different LFO and a different wavetable. All the processing is exactly the same. Bounce that into audio. This is what that sounds like without any post-processing. So it sounds pretty similar to the womp at the moment, but this fuzz pedal here is doing a lot of legwork bringing out the sustain of the sound. And then we got this frequency shifter, which is used a few times, or act as like a tape stop. Then we got these dispersers. This is a pretty significant part of the sound. So this is with the disperser. And this is without the 3 dispersers. They're all in different positions actually. Just makes it so that it's not all bunching up certain frequencies, because I found that disperser can sort of add a little bit of muddiness where there doesn't need to be. So if you spread them out a little bit, makes it a bit less muddy or focused on one specific frequency range. We got the saturator, adding a shitload of volume even though there isn't a lot of drive. That's because I put it on hard curve mode and taken down the output a little bit. And then we got the Hail Your OTT, which is just OTT but with no low end compression. And without. With. Just compresses it a little bit so it's not as peaky. And then we got this reverb throw here. Same reverb as the Womp pedal again. It's doing a similar envelope to the pedal that we have at the start of the chain, but it's slightly different because it has less gain than the first pedal. Then we have EQ. Nothing crazy. Some surgical cuts, some less than surgical cuts. And then we have a glue compressor at the end to make sure that it's compressed and not clipping. One of my favorite things about Ableton's glue compressor over Saturator as a soft clipper is that when you use the Saturator soft clipper, if the dry wet isn't at 100% on the Saturator, things will still go over 0, even if you have soft clip on. But with Ableton's glue compressor, with the soft clip on, you can put the dry wet at anything and it will still prevent clipping, which is good and nice. There's also this saw layer, which is only in the second drop. Nothing crazy, it's literally just a super saw, 16 voices, 2 oscillators, pitch modulation, one of the oscillators is an octave higher, saturator to bring it out, EQ to cut any lows and a little bit of the highs, and a glue compressor just to compress and soft clip once again. So that about covers it. Thank you for watching. I'll be doing more tutorial videos, so I hope you got something out of it. Have a good day.